Hey there. We're going to be talking about affirmative action today. So get ready. And what's going to be important for you is whether or not you really want to understand affirmative action, not what you just heard about. So without further ado, let's get started. Hi, everybody. Hi, anyone. I don't know how many people are going to be popping in. I hope you can hear me because some of my videos have been coming out a little raspy. So I have my microphone placed pretty well strategically situated so that you can hear me as I speak. Um, I'm going to be talking about affirmative action today. So if you're interested in understanding the unbleached version of affirmative action, what was just basically stricken from the Constitution, well, not from the Constitution, but stricken as a policy and deemed unconstitutional, stick around. I'm looking for my illuminators. If you are illuminators, you can show your support for me by just finding that like button and please hit the like on the way in. I'd really appreciate it. Um, I'm trying to get a computer. Ordinarily, I would not be soliciting for things for monetary compensation because I'm not here for money. But if you want to donate to the Dr. Cynthia New Computer Fund, please feel free. The information is below. Now, I just want you to understand that critical thinking is necessary here. You're going to have to really think and maybe watch this video a couple of times. I'm going to be showing you a video in the next few minutes, which is going to show you how insidious white supremacist propaganda works neutrally and ambiguously to describe this policy as it stood. Then I'm going to show you what this policy actually was supposed to provide, what its purpose was, what companies and colleges and universities had to do in order to comply, and um, statements that they were going to have to make, which, of course, now that they've stricken down race as unconstitutional, you're going to start seeing in their affirmative action, um, if they even bother to use affirmative action rhetoric or equal employment opportunity signage and as part of their company policy, I believe race will be taken out. Okay. Here's another thing. They use the words, and this video will show them using what's called race neutral um, versus racial preference. No such thing in affirmative action. Affirmative action was supposed to be race neutral. It was supposed to be without regard to race and the other things that I'm going to talk about. So let me just get to this video and then we can start talking about it. I'm also going to be reading my latest essay on the subject. So,
to make their campuses more diverse.
I hope you can hear it.
Considering an applicant's race, generally called affirmative action, has long been standard at universities from UPenn to Harvard, but not anymore. The Supreme Court has ruled that no college in the US can consider an applicant's race in admissions. 9 states have already banned this practice. California did almost 25 years ago. Just enough time for a detailed study on its consequences.
Once you have the data set in hand, there's an awful lot you can learn, honestly, pretty quickly, right? Basically, what I'm doing is just differences in means. What happened to the kids after night, what kids before night? Just those comparisons tell you an awful lot about not just what happened in California, but I think what we can expect to happen across the country.
Here's how affirmative action changed college admissions and what the future of higher education might look like without it. Action. Selecting which of these student applicants would be accepted was fairly simple. Most colleges would essentially filter students. They'd set factors like a minimum GPA or a minimum test score, and voila, there's your pool of accepted students. Obviously, the more
Okay, here's why this is already ridiculous. Uh, just do a little research and you'll find that uh, SAT scores, SAT tests, were created and designed by a known eugenicist, and we'll get into that another time about SATs and college boards and all those kinds of strategic kinds of enrollment uh, uh, guarantees that they would eliminate black people from these colleges and universities. Notice how in the very beginning of this video they talked about um, in the beginning of the video they talked about race as being the only thing that affirmative action was about. Notice that? They didn't explain what affirmative action was about. They just automatically honed in on race. Okay? So remember that as we go forward.
more selective the school, the higher those standards were. But
a big part of both test scores and grades are pre-18 educational investment and honestly non-educational investment, the degree to which you had a stable household, the degree to which you have some notion of being able to focus on your work. The better a high school you go to, the better the test score you get. The better sort of access to resources outside of high school, like tutoring or other services that you had access to before 18, the better you test.
it's clear if you break down SAT scores by the background of the student. Students from higher income households score higher. Same if you look at who grew up in a household with a parent with a graduate degree versus no degree. That also reflects in race, with Black and Hispanic students scoring lower than white and Asian students. So in the 1970s, when UC Berkeley's admissions really just looked at GPA and test scores, the student population was less than 5% Black and Hispanic.
Students who might have been really high ability just weren't able to get the kind of education that would lead them to the kind of high standardized tests that would get them into Berkeley recognized that they needed some way of admitting those students. And so they started affirmative action policies to try to bring in students from sort of every part of, in this case, the state of California.
So in the 80s, they began considering race in their admissions decisions. It worked. By the 90s, they would chart students on a social diversity index. If you were low income and a minority and had moderate grades and test scores, you were in. If you were high income and white, you needed higher scores to get in. Some colleges, like the UC Davis School of Medicine, used quotas, utilizing a similar filtering system, but a few spots would be reserved for minority applicants. In the late 70s, a white student named Backy fell here. Not good enough to get in on other white applicants, but with higher test scores and GPA than the minority students who got in. He sued, claiming discrimination. It made it to the Supreme Court, he won, and was admitted. The court ruled that while the goal of achieving a diverse student body is sufficiently compelling to justify consideration of race in admissions decisions, specific quotas went too far. More than 24 Supreme Court cases have followed, including the landmark Grutter v. Bollinger in 2003, which upheld that race could be considered as part of a individualized holistic review of each applicant's file. That's essentially how affirmative action has worked the last 20 years. Instead of just filtering a pool of applicants, most colleges look at each person individually. Like Harvard will look at SAT and GPA, but also things like extracurricular activities, essays, awards, life experiences, recommendations, leadership, and yes, race. But this is exactly what the Supreme Court has now struck down. In two separate cases against Harvard and the University of North Carolina, plaintiffs argued this holistic approach was just a cover for discrimination against white and Asian students. The Supreme Court agreed, ruling that eliminating racial discrimination means eliminating all of it. The student must be treated based on his or her experiences as an individual, not on the basis of race. Many universities have for too long done just the opposite, which means in this holistic review, race can no longer be considered.
To the degree that these universities want to maintain their current level of racial diversity, California has shown that that is infeasible, at least given the policies that California has tried to implement.
In the 90s, Californians voted for Proposition 209, which banned public universities from considering race. Zach Bleemer conducted a massive study in California, following students that applied before and after Prop 209, looking at where they eventually enrolled, graduated, and then at their wage statements.
So you can see, so long as they stay in the state of California, where they work and how much they earn all the way through 2020, 25 years almost after the affirmative action ban was implemented.
What he found was that Black and Hispanic enrollments at more selective schools, like Berkeley, dramatically fell when they couldn't include race in their admissions process. Moderately selective schools had almost no change, but enrollment at less selective schools actually rose. Because most Black and Hispanic students didn't not go to college, they just went to less esteemed ones.
You got this cascade effect of Black and Hispanic students on average enrolling at a university that's just a little bit less selective than the youth they used to have. Used to go to Berkeley are now going to UC Davis. Kids who used to go to UC Davis are now going to UC Santa Cruz. What happened is pretty substantial negative ramifications for these students.
They became less likely to earn STEM degrees, less likely to go to graduate school. Those with the lowest GPA and test scores became less likely to even graduate. And overall, Black and Hispanic students earned less in their careers than those admitted before Prop 209.
One thing we've learned from affirmative action bans is that the kids who are admitted to more selective universities as a result of race-based affirmative action tend to receive greater value from those institutions in terms of which those institutions lead them to more successful jobs or more success in the labor market than the white or Asian students who tend to take their places after the end of affirmative action programs.
Bleemer has also studied the effects of what's called race-neutral admissions policies, which can include outreach and income-based admissions, as has Georgetown University. They both found the same result.
It seems like all of these race-neutral alternatives that universities can implement have a tendency toward increasing the diversity of campuses, but they don't get you anywhere close to the level of racial diversity that's provided by race-based affirmative action.
Harvard said if it were to not include race in their holistic review, Black and Hispanic enrollment will decline by almost half. Berkeley, even though it has made strides since Prop 209 to enroll more Hispanic students, the Black student population is still below where it was when it could consider race in admissions.
I think we'll see declines in Black and Hispanic enrollment, potentially in some cases quite severe declines in the next couple of years. And as a result, you're going to have this sort of downward shift, Black and Hispanic students enrolling at less selective schools than they had access to previously. There's no clear silver bullet for such universities just to maintain diversity as it is right now.
Okay, what did you get from that? Well, I'll tell you. What I got from it was that affirmative action was about race. Hold on a second. Let me take that off and and end that. Um, what I got from that was that affirmative action was all about hiring less qualified or admitting less qualified black, and of course they include Hispanic. But I'm just going to say black here because that's what this is really all about. Because let's face it, the entire civil rights movement was about black equal opportunity, equality, equity, opportunity, and justice. Okay, let's not get that twisted. That is the unbleached fact. Okay, so that video for me sounded very much like affirmative action was a plan to hire and admit black people to on to hire to actually hire these people or admit these people on the basis of their race, which was black. Well, let me tell you, I'm going to go here now and I'm going to open up for you this statement of affirmative action policy that companies had to adhere, not, well, companies were encouraged to adhere to, unless, of course, they had a consent decree and had to. And companies, corporations, and colleges and universities who received funds from the federal government, of course, had to abide. Okay, so let me share this screen, and this is the statement of affirmative action policy. Now, what this is a boilerplate type of policy, and I'll read just a little bit of it for you. I hope you can hear me. It is the policy of, and the company would insert the company name or the college or university, to provide equal opportunities without regard. Now, I want you to hear this. This is the statement of affirmative action policy. Now, when I read this to you, you're going to see that this was not supposed to be just about race. To provide equal opportunities without regard to race, color, religion, sex, national origin, age, disability, marital status, veteran status, sexual orientation, genetic information, or any other protected characteristic under applicable law. Okay, this policy relates to all phases of employment, including but not limited to recruiting, employment, placement, promotion, transfer, demotion, reduction of workforce, and termination rates of pay or other forms of compensation, selection for training, the use of all facilities, and participation in all company sponsored employee activities. Provisions in applicable laws providing for bona fide occupational qualifications, business necessity, or age limitations will be all that adhered to by the company or university, college where appropriate. Okay? Are you listening? Affirmative action was supposed to be applied without regard for race and the other characteristics and circumstances and underrepresented groups that I mentioned. So right away you think, okay, well, if this is the case, then why? Then why did that video just kind of make it look like affirmative action was just about hiring unqualified or less qualified black people over white people? As part of the company's university, colleges, equal opportunity policy, then the company name would be put in, will also take affirmative action as called for by applicable laws and executive orders to ensure that minority group individuals, females, disabled veterans, recently separated veterans, other protected veterans, armed forces service medal veterans, and qualified disabled persons are introduced into our college university workforce as considered for promotional opportunities. And what generally would happen is they would hire the company or the university would hire an affirmative action officer or administrator of some kind to administer the program. Okay? This is the reason why you began to see the words EEO, employer, uh, equal employment opportunity, those phrases you saw at the bottoms of everything, of every application, or somewhere visible in especially in online ads. And we are an equal employment opportunity, or we are an equal opportunity organization. So you have to understand that the way that they positioned affirmative action themselves, they did that. White people. That it was supposed to be done without regard to race and things like that. So affirmative action was essentially race neutral. Yet, yet, they are saying to you today that affirmative action and race neutrality are two different things. Mm-mm. No, you can't get that one past me. You won't get that one past me. Now, I did also find something interesting in terms of what companies had to do in order to establish what's called an affirmative action plan. Now, the affirmative action plan, they had to They had to perform what there were three things that were very important, and one of the things was to uh, create a reasonable self-analysis, an analysis of themselves in a reasonable way. The objective of a self analysis is to determine whether employment practices do or tend to exclude, disadvantage, restrict, or result in adverse impact or disparate treatment of previously excluded or restricted groups. See, you have to keep in mind there is a difference between those two words. There is a difference between those two words, excluded and restricted. Black people were excluded from colleges and universities based on race. So basically, race was used against black people. And affirmative action was telling them, you can't use our race to deny us. This is what affirmative action was supposed to do. This was the function. It was to say, you can now look at yourselves, see where you've gone wrong, so to speak, evaluate yourself. Find a reasonable basis in terms of the employment practices have or tend to have an adverse effect on employment opportunities of members of previously excluded groups. Come on, we all know what that previously excluded group was. Then you take reasonable action. Then we have the standards for reasonable action. In considering the reasonableness of a particular affirmative action plan or program, the standards would be applied where the plan would be tailored to solve the problems which were identified in the self analysis and to ensure that employment or educational systems operate fairly in the future while avoiding unnecessary restrictions on opportunities for the workforce as a whole. The race, sex, and national origin conscious provisions of the plan or program should be maintained only so long as is necessary to achieve these objectives. Now, what they began to call quotas, and you heard that in the video, a quota was nothing more than a goal and a timetable for that goal. But they flipped it and made it sound like we're being forced by means of a quota to go out to these schools, these predominantly black schools, to see if there are some qualified people who we would just not ordinarily even look for. In fact, uh, a well known news broadcaster, black news broadcaster for MSNBC, who went to Harvard, explained how affirmative action helped her because they actually went out recruiting. They went to look. She was smart as a whip, but nobody would have known because nobody goes out to predominantly black schools to look for the gems. So basically, folks, basically, I get so bent. I do. I get really, really bent when I talk about this stuff because, the way that they finagle things to wording, this is why my focus is on terminology, wording, not linguistics, but the way, you know, comprehension, connotation, context, the way that these terms, these phrases, these words, the way that they can be manipulated to make you think one way when it's the other way, another way. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to read for you after, of course, I print this baby out. Hold on one second. I should have printed it out before I should have printed it out before I got on here. I want to read for you my essay. This essay can be found on Medium, and it is available on Medium. You should become a member and follow me on Medium so that you can get all of my essays when I write them. I generally will write them when I am. Where's my print function? Hold on. There we go. I generally write essays when I feel inspired, whether it's a kind of whether it's positively inspired or even negatively inspired. But I pretty much have to be inspired in order to write an essay. So as it's printing out, here it comes. Thank you, those of you who have joined me, and those of you who are going to watch the replay, please remember to. Oh, this is a long one. Please remember to hit that like button. I find that I'm hearing that is very, very, very important to establishing oneself in terms of validity and getting placed into a particular algorithm. I find that there's so many other educators I've been watching, other educators. 9 out of 10 of them are white, and they have thousands and thousands and thousands of subscribers. I presently have 701, and I'm very grateful for that because I can remember for years I had about 40. But you see, this is important. These are issues that are important to know, even if you're not going to talk about them every day. You should be aware. It's important that we are aware. Now, this essay is entitled Turning Off the Gaslight in the Neutrality and Inclusivity of Affirmative Action. And if you understand what I showed you earlier, you understand this title because affirmative action was written to say that it was supposed to work without regard to this. And yet, it became all about race, which it really was about anyway. it was supposed to be reparative relief for black people, but you have to understand they are never, ever, 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 ever going to put something into legislation or make a policy or an executive order that specifically says this here is for black people. They're never, ever, ever, ever going to do that. The Voting Rights Act. We know for a fact that the Voting Rights Act is about voting rights for black people. Black people. What do? They throw in poor people. Well, of course, because there are an overabundance of poor black people. But if they say poor people, then of course they can include the poor white people. They include Hispanics, and they include everybody else who is considered an underrepresented group. However, you know, and I know that the entirety of attempts to suppress the vote has been directed at black people. So the title is called Turning Off the Gaslight in the Neutrality and Inclusivity of Affirmative Action. America has had a penchant for using inclusivity and neutrality whenever it comes to explaining anything racial within the broader sense of the culture. And you might ask, what do I mean by that? Well, take affirmative action, for example. The Encyclopedia Britannica calls it an active effort to improve employment or educational opportunities for members of minority groups and for women. Affirmative action began as a government remedy to the effects of long-standing discrimination against such groups and has consisted of policies, programs, and procedures that give limited preferences. How many of you have ever heard me use the term limited apportionment? Well, that is the same thing. And the Civil Rights Act itself and Title VII, which was for equal employment and educational opportunity. It was all meant for limited, whereas we were excluded, racially excluded prior to the Civil Rights Act. We were given a limited apportionment of opportunity in the areas of employment and education. And they were not going to do it without some incentive. Trust me. Let me just finish. Limited preferences to minorities and women in job hiring, admissions to institutions of higher education, the awarding of government contracts, and other social benefits. The typical criteria for affirmative action are race, disability, gender, ethnic origin, and age. So you hear that, right? Note to self, why include women specifically when all so called minority groups include women? Step back, put on your thinking cap. Put on your thinking cap. Why would they include women as a separate entity from minority groups? When, of course, men and women encompass minority groups, women are included in that group, right? So they say, and women. So you have to understand, minority groups aren't even here, they're not even being considered as, I would imagine, as human. Okay, so why include women specifically when all minority groups include women? This differentiation therefore means what, class? Raise your hand. White women. In particular, limited preferences is a misnomer, since affirmative action means to actively recruit, consider, and hire or admit Negroes who were never even considered prior to the inception of the Civil Rights Act and its provisions. And that was one. That was the Encyclopedia Britannica's definition of affirmative action. Now we have Investopedia. Investopedia defines affirmative action this way: affirmative action refers to a policy aimed at increasing workplace and educational opportunities for people who are underrepresented in various areas of our society. It focuses on demographics with historically low representation. I want you to understand what is being said here. Understand the context. Comprehend the context so that you can get the proper connotation from this. Okay? It is often a means of countering discrimination against particular groups. Note to self, during the inception of the Act and provisions such as affirmative action, underrepresented was a euphemism for what? Raise your hand, class. Negro. Demographics with historically low representation is a euphemistic phrase meaning black people or the Negro. Okay? Let's not get that twisted. This is how they work the language. This is how they use the language in order to achieve whatever it is that they're trying to achieve in terms of schooling or explaining without giving credence to or value to black people in particular. Cornell University considered affirmative action as a set of procedures designed to eliminate unlawful discrimination among applicants, remedy the results of such prior discrimination, and prevent such discrimination in the future. Applicants may be seeking admission to an educational program or looking for professional employment. In modern American jurisprudence, it typically imposes imposes, okay, an imposition. So it imposes remedies against discrimination. Basically, they're saying they make you stop discriminating as though discrimination is like okay. So they're going to force you not to on the basis of at least race, creed, color, and national origin. Notice again here that it is inclusive of other affected groups, characteristics, things of that nature. It's not just race. Well, they would make you think. I mean, the way they wrote it was something without regard to these things. Note to self. By far, this is the most neutral definition. And it assumes the applicants, the people, what they call applicants. See, they didn't say minorities and women or, they said applicants. They didn't say demographically challenged. They said applicants, whether they're applicants for educational opportunities, higher education, or employment. So they assume that the applicants include men and women. I was being facetious there. Now, countless others offer similar definitions for affirmative action. And indeed, if we understand the meaning of the terms affirmative and action, where the former means the expression of approval and agreement, and the latter means to do something to accomplish a goal, aim, or purpose, taken together, it means approval and in agreement in, of, and for accomplishing a goal, aim, or purpose, which was to stop discriminating against the affected groups that they named, inclusive of race. In the case of Black Americans, affirmative action was supposed to mean the reparative relief from discrimination in the areas of employment and education. Since the passing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was not enough by itself to provide even the barest of opportunity in the form of equity and equality in those areas by itself without good faith efforts by companies, corporations, and educational institutions to begin to actively look for. All they're saying is just go to the black school, go to the Hispanic school. You know they all still segregated. Stop just going to friends select and friends this and friends that and these elite institutions to recruit white institutions, private schools. Also, it's kind of like, yeah, Black Lives Matter too in education and employment. So they were asked, they needed a good faith effort to recruit, consider, and accept qualified Black people into their organizations, as well as others. I mean, let's face it, What does it say? What has it said time and time again that I've been reading? It was a whole lot of groups, characteristics and such, who were included as affected parties in affirmative action. Wasn't just us, right? As most of my essays start out with some historical background or definition of terms, this essay is not really intended to provide the entire history of affirmative action, since just as there are countless definitions, there are countless explanations of its history, as well as opinions both for and against the policy and practices. What I intend to do is unbleach any notion of neutrality and inclusivity permeating out of the rhetoric and embodiment of any policy that was remotely, and I use that term very tightly, not loosely, remotely created to help Black Americans, and how neutrality and inclusivity has worked against us, not for us, time and time again over the generations. The Civil Rights Act came directly out of a Black movement for equality, equity, opportunity, and justice. And you know, I often say the only thing that we got from the civil rights movement was limited apportionment of opportunity in the areas of employment and education. We did not get the justice because the police are still able to just run roughshod and willy nilly in our neighborhoods and kill our people at will, instead of protecting and serving, which is what they are supposed to be doing. And yet, so it says here, the Civil Rights Act came directly out of a Black movement for equality, equity, opportunity, and justice. And yet, not one whitened body of politics or policy would dare describe the act as a direct result of the Black struggle. No. Just like they will never, ever, 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 ever come out with legislation, executive orders, or some sort of policy that is absolutely specific to us. They just will not do it ever. Everything that they do, they couch it under the shroud of race neutrality. That old, without regard to race. Whenever they say, they're race neutral, it's without regard to race, sex, da 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 da. When described in the news, terms like race, while mentioned, were not made the primary reason for any policy or legislation clearly coming out of the Black struggle. We will be included with every other class, group, characteristic, national origin, everything. We will be included in that. We will be thrown into that pool of of neutrality. Instead, the country was going to stop discriminating on the basis of race and other so called underrepresented groups. The term civil itself became decidedly a dog whistle and euphemism for black and Negro, and it was completely obvious the black white binary was the actual issue. Come on. January 6th. I mean, why even have a Confederate flag? Why bring the Confederate flag to the party if you're not talking about black and white? However, as is the case, some 55 years later, a minuscule few will even admit everything in America is about black and white, as though every other color, as though every other color that is stated today was representative of the kinds of discrimination imposed by Jim Crow on the Negro in particular. Even though no other ethnicity wanted to be included in the moniker colored. As the vanguard, and I say that often because black people are standing as the vanguard for democracy and the rights of humanity. So, as the vanguard of the struggle for desegregation and non discrimination, black people fought on the front lines for equality, equity, opportunity, and justice. And as a reward for this work, black people were included rather than the direct beneficiaries and recipients of any attempt at redress, since the wording was created to be neutral so as to ensure all future underrepresented groups would be considered. And they tacked them on as it came and just kept tacking on some more. And I'm not saying this to say that that's a bad thing, because nobody should be discriminated against about for any reason. Affirmative action was a vehicle for employers, colleges, and universities to actively recruit qualified black people and then admit and hire them, since they had never done so in the past, and actively discriminated against them. For purposes of this essay, race was going to be used for for black people instead of against them. We were included in that, within that umbrella. We were included. We were included. Finally. Not many companies or educational institutions did so willingly, however, and the policy and legislation only counted government contractors and institutions that received federal funds as requirements. Some only complied after consent decrees were placed on them as a result of willful discrimination. Black women were essentially recruited more often than black men. According to the American Association of University Women, among black students in higher education, the women are more likely than the men to earn degrees. Black women get 64.1% of bachelor's degrees, 71.5% of master's degrees, and 65.9% of doctoral, medical, and dental degrees, respectively. And I'm sure that number is going to go down considerably as a result of this Supreme Court ruling. It can be reasonably assumed that many colleges and universities actively recruited black women because they got a twofer. And I know, and look, we know this because this has been discussed in black circles. Trust me, the twofer, okay, the twofer, or a stat for both a black and a woman. When I was working in affirmative action for a banking institution in their legal department, some of the statistics uh, that I did showed a little a tick in the black column and the woman column. They counted for two. And yet, while it would appear that black women have benefited more than black men, the AAUW states that black women are significantly less than white women to enroll in four-year colleges, graduate within 6 years, and go on to earn advanced degrees. Both white men and white women continue to outrank black men and women in terms of acceptance into colleges and universities, affirmative action notwithstanding. So using race for rather than against black people had no dramatic effect on the attendance of white people in higher education. Obviously, there's no real dramatic effect in the acceptance and attendance of white people. However, and as you heard on that video, 9 states abolished affirmative action by race in their universities and colleges, California being one of them. So, as a contrast, according to the National Center for Education Statistics, since 2017, after California dropped what they called racial preferences from their admissions policy, applications by black prospective students dropped over 30%. Therefore, race used for rather than against black people had a very dramatic effect on the admissions and attendance for black people when abolished. So who's really being affected by this thing? One way or the other. It wasn't stopping white people, but now this is certainly going to stop black people. And that was the goal. That was the purpose of the Supreme Court decision. Make no mistake. Don't get it twisted. Don't think it was any other reason. Don't be foolish enough to think it was for any other reason. Note to self. The term racial preferences, like quotas, are used liberally in white supremacism to diminish the purpose of affirmative action. A racial preference actually meant non discrimination, and actively seeking qualified applicants. A quota meant a realistic goal, which usually meant one or two recruits and or hires or admissions during a specific period of time. That's the truth. Affirmative action was supposed to remedy past discrimination of who in America? Who in America suffered worse due to generations of enslavement and Jim Crow? Who is referenced as the prime example when discussing such redress? Whenever the subject of affirmative action is why is it used to describe black people as inferior and less qualified over qualified white people, while accepting as merit the upward mobility for white women who benefited the most from it? Anyone, anyone with an ounce of understanding of the way white supremacism operates knows using language that appears, quote, neutral by including more than, quote, race, waters down the legislation or the policy to give the appearance of a desire to be affirmative in its actions and civil with respect to rights inclusive of black people as well. Yet, think about it. According to its own cultural principles in America, the races are either black or white, and anything else is a nationality, an ethnicity, or the language spoken. Okay? Let's not get this whole race thing twisted. Here is the unbleached truth about race in this country. In America, in the United States, race means black or white. Anything else is a nationality, an ethnicity, or the language spoken. The entire premise behind white supremacism is the ideology of superiority. Everything else is ancillary to that ideology. Hatred is its own issue and not being considered in this essay. Therefore, it stands to reason that they would immediately and successfully adopt the lie that the entire policy and its programs were discriminating against themselves, who were by far more superior by allowing these inferior, uneducated, lazy black people to go to the head of the line. To this day, this lie is perpetrated by these racists to stop even the recruitment. To stop even the recruitment. If you say, I'm going to yada yada school in yada yada, Georgia, which might be predominantly black, that college or university can say, oh, no, you're not. You are going against affirmative action guidelines with regard to race. You're not supposed to look for them. You're not supposed to go out and actively look for somebody black no more. To this day, this lie is perpetrated by these racists to stop even the recruitment of black people into their spaces, and it is the overarching rationale for all of the attempts made to abolish affirmative action as the Roberts Court just did. The latest Supreme Court ruling has used the same neutral and inclusive language as the Civil Rights Act itself, and the affirmative action policy and procedures regarding so called affected persons to destroy affirmative action. They basically turned the inclusivity and the neutrality of the policy on itself, using the same language to take out race. Recall, however, in doing so, they are very specific in the use of the term race when deciding what has been deemed unconstitutional. There is no mention of any of the others included as affected persons and characteristics. Only race. Only race. By now, we should all know when the term race is invoked, it means black. Therefore, it behooves an answer as to why they even included the other affected, underrepresented demographic characteristics in the policy for protection. If protecting them wasn't at risk of being determined unconstitutional. Does this mean that any other affected, unrepresented group is still protected by affirmative action? Who is the use of race for? Why is the use of race for rather than against black people unconstitutional and the others aren't? That's something to think about. That's something to give some really careful thought to. Veterans still get preferences, and that's a good thing. They should. But black people can't. Hundreds and hundreds of years of enslavement and over 100 years of discrimination that continues today. Discrimination still permeates this country. So, what does that tell you? I'll tell you what it tells me. It tells me that using race for the benefit of black people is now considered unconstitutional. It tells me that in this country, tells me everything in this country and its culture has and will continue to be all about race. It has always been about the desire of whiteness to feign superiority over blackness, using both color and character. It has always been about race. And the race always in the vanguard is black, and that's it. So that concludes this essay and this lecture on affirmative action. I hope you learned something important about affirmative action. The fact that And you will pay special attention to the use of these what they call neutral, the neutral language, and how this neutral language, as it is placed into policies and legislation, supposedly to help us, always ends up hurting us in the end. So please hit the like button. Please hit the like. Please hit the like. Again, if you want to contribute to, I have to laugh when I say it. I'm sorry, because I'm gonna get my computer anyway. I'm gonna get my new computer anyway. Come hell or high water. But um, if you want to contribute to the give Auntie Dr. Cindy a new computer, there's my Cash App, my Venmo, and my PayPal. Greatly appreciated, but not required. Not required whatsoever. I just enjoy being here, and I enjoy uh, my illuminators. I wish that more would have been able to come aboard and hear the lecture, but I know I got to be taking in small doses sometimes. Oh, yeah, I got to be taking in small doses sometimes. I want to say hi to Ruth. Les. Hello, Ruth. How are you? I hope you're still here. I really appreciate that you came to listen to the lecture. I see your light bulbs. Mwah, that's for you. That's for you. Thank you for coming. And anybody who gets in on the replay, do remember to like, share, and subscribe if you haven't subscribed already. Okay? Until the next time that we meet, which I really don't know when. I have to be inspired. Bye bye.